It was last Sunday morning when I came out into the garden to sit, have a cup of coffee, looked over my back fence, and there looking back at me were the faces of two cows in the field that's behind my house. And it took me back to my very young days when I was literally just a toddler and not much more than that. My parents lived in a village, well, it was a hamlet really then, just outside of Cambridge called Boxworth. Just a few cottages, a pub and a post office was all that the hamlet consisted of. My father was serving in the RAF and I guess this was where the quarters were that he could rent. I'm rather embarrassed to say that actually I can remember very vaguely back into those days seeing the combine or the harvester coming down the street, the threshing machine, not a huge mechanical thing like we would see today in the fields, but something that was drawn by two huge Shire horses. And indeed, I remember going into the fields and seeing literally the sheaves of corn stacked up. Man, I am just so old these days. Jesus uses something of a farming analogy or an illustration when he speaks to the people who are listening to him, that's found in Matthew's Gospel. Listen to what he says. "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, we need to understand something of the context, not just of the farming community, but to who Jesus was speaking to then. He was speaking, if you look into Matthew 10 and the first part of Matthew 11, you discover that he's making reference to people who are feeling really burdened by the regulations, the rituals, the conformity that is being placed upon them in their day. This Pharisaical way of looking at the day says that in fact there were over 600 laws that just pertain to what you could and you couldn't do on the day of Sabbath, on the Shabbat. And of course, most of them were not about things that you could do, but they were things that you couldn't do. I, like many, spend an awful lot of my time at the moment just reading through guidelines and regulations about what we are allowed to do and what we won't be allowed to do when we come back to worship together at church. Just reading them often leaves me feeling very weary and just really tired, let alone the complications of trying to implement them. Jesus was really concerned that the focus of God's people had been drawn towards a set of rules and regulations rather than what it meant to really explore the relationship, the sense of being loved and held by a God who loved them so much, about being able to explore what it meant to be somebody in deep relationship with him. Lots of folk over the years have said that relationship is much, much more important than religion. So how we know God is much more important than trying to interpret the rules and regulations that he sets for our life. And what Jesus is saying here is that actually if you have the relationship right, then any rules, if you like, of engagement actually don't become a burden, but become something that enhances the way that we live our lives. Now, we've all seen something of a yoke. We know what it looks like if we visited a living farming museum, or we've been to an agricultural show. We may have seen something of this huge sort of block, this beam of wood that is placed upon the shoulders of two beasts of the field to pull the implements and work the land. Perhaps what we don't understand is that in the day of Jesus, It was that this yoke was something that was literally handcrafted for the 2 oxen that you owned. It wasn't a case that you went off to your local agricultural dealers or hardware shop and took off of the shelf a yoke and just placed it on your beast. It was hand-carved, it was hand-tailored to the animals that you had, so it took into account the weight, the height disparity between the 2 of them. It was about them so that they could work effectively together. And it needed to be hand carved, because if you just took something that was stock, the reality was that actually the animals would end up with sores on their shoulder, or it would be out of balance between them, and they wouldn't be able to work together in harmony, one with another. The yoke was a really important and precious piece of equipment. It not only allowed one animal to feel what the other was doing, but it was so important that if an animal died or you needed to sell one, actually the yoke was of no value any longer whatsoever. It was key and integral to the productivity, the efficiency of the relationship between the 2 animals. So is it here that Jesus is suggesting that actually in our relationship with God, it's not just about conformity that is important, but it's about understanding that relationship, that codependency that we can have upon Him. It was also, when you brought a team of oxen together, there was always the matching of an older and a younger beast too. So literally, the older beast was the teacher, the younger beast was the student. The older beast, in a sense, took the lead that gave direction, and the younger beast added, if you like, energy and momentum to make sure that the land could be ploughed or the harvester could be pulled along. It was the workhorse, it was the engine of the relationship. So maybe it is that Jesus is saying to us, take my yoke upon you. Come and learn from me. See the way that I do it. See the way that I engage. Work next to me, not behind me, not in front of me, not at a distance from me, but work next to me, that we're together in that sense of partnership. The other significant thing that we often lose sight of in this passage is the word that Jesus uses where he says, take my yoke upon you. He doesn't say, I'm going to place it upon you, but he says, take my yoke upon you. Now, when we understand the word take, it's about taking something off of a shelf or taking something out of the cupboard. But that's not the original meaning of the word that's used there. The original meaning of the word take is about elevating oneself to a position. It's about stepping into a role and a function. It's about that we have free rein to take the yoke upon us. It isn't something that we're forced to do. It isn't an enforcement upon our lives, but it's an invitation to participate in. I love it is that Eugene Peterson translates the latter part of this phrase when he says this: walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything ill-fitting or heavy on you. I love that phrase, learn the unforced rhythms of grace. It's about learning from a teacher. It's about being in step. It's about setting up that harmonic balance between 2 people. Paul also makes a sense of reference to this when he writes to the church in Galatia, and he says this in the 5th chapter. He says that if we're the people who walk with the Spirit, and he goes on to say, then let us keep step with the Spirit. In other words, again, no disharmony. There's a sense in which we're invited to participate in this most extraordinary partnership relationship with God. Doesn't make us equal with God, but it's an invite that God says, you don't need to be distant. You don't need to be away from me. You don't need to be somehow sort of just watching what goes on. But I want you to experience the whole process. Interesting, going back to Matthew 11, it was shortly after this that Jesus sends the disciples out so they might experience something of the work that he's been doing with them for themselves. So as we come and we continue to move through this lockdown period where so much is unfamiliar, so much is out of kilter with how we would want to do things, will you remember this promise that God has given to us, that he invites us to step into the yoke. He invites us to learn from him, to carry not a burden, but something that fits us well, that's tailor-made for who we are. Listen to this prayer, would you? Lord, I admit that I've been trying to pull the whole load by myself. I simply can't do it any longer. I have given every ounce of my strength now, and I need you to come alongside me and help me finish the task that is before me. I'm willing to do it, but I must have your help. So today, I'm asking you to become yoked with me in my job, my business, my ministry, my family, and in all my personal affairs. In the name of Christ. Amen.